Hello students, I am Dr. Saliha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography from Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. I am here with the course Climate Change, Vulnerability and Adaptation. In previous lectures, we have studied about the basics of the climate change. What is climate change? What are the elements and components of the climate change? The transformation and shift that has taken in climate change. Then its physical, economic, social vulnerability, and also the different natural cycles which are affected by the climate change, like carbon cycle, we can say food web and food chain. This all thing we have talked about. In this week we are talking about the different organization, bodies, treaties which are working for the mitigation, adaptation and resilience against the climate change, how they are trying to mitigate with the climate change, what are the rules and regulation policies they have framed. So under this also we have studied about the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol, and today we are going to study about the Conference of Parties. So let us start our class, student. Welcome to today's class. So when I talk about Conference of Parties, little bit you must be having knowledge about this because earlier in my previous lecture I have discussed this. Let me give the little bit background about it. When the people and the different nations, communities started to thinking several decades back that there is global warming due to the greenhouse effects. If this global warming and rise in global temperature continues, it will have sometime irreversible impact on overall ecosystem and sustainability of the human beings. So to discuss these things, they had a Rio Earth Summit under which UNFCCC was adopted. It was adopted in Rio Earth Summit, but after 2 years it came into force. So that UNFCCC, actually it had almost all the countries of the world which were parties of this organization. UNFCCC, here I am talking about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So here the highest decision making body used to meet every year to talk about the climate actions, the scenario of the climate change that is going, the predictions about the climate change. It used to frame out some of the policies, how the greenhouse emissions can be reduced, how the rising global temperature can be controlled. So for this, the highest decision making bodies of different countries used to meet every year. This meeting of highest decision making bodies from the different countries is known as COP, that is Conference of Parties. Means it is a part of UNFCCC. That's why it is said that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is UNFCCC, is the highest decision making body in the Conference of Parties. So Conference of Parties is simply the highest decision making bodies meeting which was formulated in UNFCCC. Nearly it had representatives of all different countries, you can say 197 or 200 nations. They generally get together. The representatives of the different nations come to meet together at a particular venue, the decided venue for Conference of Parties conference, in order to discuss what further the international effort will be to combat with the climate change. These gatherings generally provide a particular forum, a particular framework for discussing and evaluating the applications of different climate accords, if like Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol. Already, if you remember, we have discussed Kyoto Protocol. So actually it discusses what has been achieved in previous Conference of Parties accords. From that accords, what have been achieved and what is to be achieved and how is to be achieved. So it is a forum for discussing and evaluating the applications of climate accords of different Conference of Parties. Here different important decisions and promises are made in order to advance global climate action, which are generally made at different conference of parties summit, and these conference of parties are generally numbered according to the number. For example, in 1994 the UNFCCC was established and came into force. Although it was adopted 2 year before, but it came into force in 1994. If we talk about the Kyoto Protocol, then we must say that it's a 1997. It was Kyoto Protocol is the third conference of party. Means 1994, then 1995, 1996 and 1997. Means it was the third meeting of conference of parties. 1, 2, 3. So that's why it is so Kyoto Protocol is said as COP3. So like this it is numbered. For example, if we talk about Paris Agreement, COP15, it is said means Paris Agreement Paris Agreement was generally numbered with the how many numbers of parties already previously existing, and which is to be conference of parties is to be conducted. So it is generally numbered as COP1, COP2, 3, 4, 21, 22, like this it is generally numbered. So here just you must understand what is conference of parties. Conference of parties where highest decision making bodies from the different countries, they used to meet at a particular forum in order to discuss about the certain climatic action to control the greenhouse emission and to control the global rise in temperature. And this conference of parties is a part of UNFCCC. Actually, in UNFCCC it was adopted in 1994. After that, every year these decision making bodies, the representative from these bodies used to meet, and which is known as this meeting, this conference is known as conference of parties. So let us see some of the proposals and results of the conference of parties which already that have been conducted. So some of the major one we are going to see, because there are more than 20 number of conference of parties. We cannot study each one, but major one we can discuss. Let us start from first one, that COP1, which was conducted in 1995. Why 1995? Because UNFCCC was established and came into force in 1994. And what I have said, every year the highest decision making body is used to meet. So the first meeting was held in 1995. That's why it is known as COP1, Conference of Party 1, and as it was scheduled and its venue was Berlin, so it is known as Berlin COP1, which was scheduled to be held on 1995. Here the formal negotiations under the UNFCCC framework began with the first conference of party, which took place particularly in Berlin. That's why it is known as Berlin COP1. This conference of party acknowledged that the industrial nations are the industrialized nation, the developed nations are the major polluter of the atmosphere. So these industrialized and the developed nation, they should take lead in decreasing the emissions. Here it is just acknowledged, it was identified that these nations are the major polluters. So that's why they have to take lead in the emission reduction. This marked the beginning of the process that resulted in various very important COPs like Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, etc. Let us talk about a little bit about Kyoto Protocol, because already we have discussed Kyoto Protocol in detail in the previous lecture. Kyoto Protocol is COP3, Conference of Parties 3 in 1997, and as it was scheduled in Kyoto, that's why it is known as Kyoto Protocol. And what is the special about this Kyoto Protocol? It is the first legally binding climate accord. Why I am saying first legally binding climate accord? Because under the Kyoto Protocol, several industrialized and developed nations were given a limit, that this particular limit only they can emit the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Means a limit was set for the developed nation. That's why it is known as first legally binding climate accord, and it was adopted as a result of this crucial summit. So that's why the name of the Kyoto Protocol in Conference of Parties comes as a very important one, because it is first one, the legally binding climate accord means setting the limit for the greenhouse gas emissions for the industrialized nation. And it had set a commitment period to fulfill the particular set limit, and different commitment periods were set, but the first commitment period was from 2008 to 2012, and the limit was mainly set to the countries which came in Annex 1. Annex 1 identified those countries which were developed or in the transition of the developed state. So under the Annex 1, almost I think 37 countries were identified which were either developed or in the stage of the transition to be developed. So for these countries, a certain limit was set, the how much greenhouse emission they can have for the particular year. So for this, to achieve this limit, or we can say the set goal, the commitment period was fixed, that was 2008 to 2012, and by this commitment period the developed nations were required to reduce their emissions at least by an average of 5.2% if we compare it with the 1990 levels. Means what were the level of carbon emissions before 1990s. From that it needed to cut below 5.2% as a part of Kyoto Protocol, and rest we have discussed more things about the Kyoto Protocol in the previous lecture. Again, another conference of parties meeting, that is the 13th COP, which was held in Bali. That's why it is known as Bali Meet, and it was the meeting of about 190 countries. The representative, decision making representative from the 190 countries, they were the party to this UN Treaty of the Climate Change, which was held in December 2007. The main objectives of this Bali Meet was to push the world towards taking certain actions that should reduce the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One thing here, just to remember it, students, UNFCCC was established, and its main focus was to reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So as the conference of parties is the meeting of different decision making bodies, so their main focus for each and every party is to facilitate, is to restrict and find out some framework how to reduce this greenhouse gas emission. Accordingly, the Bali Meet also focused on taking action that reduces greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. It also discussed what are the countries that are expected to do after the first phase of Kyoto end. Means the commitment period was first commitment period was 2008 to 2012, which was predicted in the Kyoto Protocol. So after that, what the countries will do, that was also discussed in this Bali Meet. And here the developing countries like India, China, Brazil, which were growing at a faster rate economically, they were also set to cut their emissions, because in Kyoto Protocol these developing countries were not counted under the binding limits. So here they were also included for cutting their emissions. Another very much important conference of party is COP15, that is known as Copenhagen, as it held in Copenhagen in 2009, and also known with the name of Copenhagen Summit, COP15, which was eagerly awaited since it was supposed to result in a Kyoto Protocol replacement, because it was supposed that it will replace Kyoto Protocol. So it was being awaited for the long time. So according to to this meet, Copenhagen meet, a political declaration which acknowledged that there is need to keep global warming below 2 degrees centigrade. So this was the major focus, that we have to keep the global warming by several means, by opting several strategies, mechanism, that the global warming should be below 2 degrees centigrade. And this target was set, and even another very important target of providing $100 billion annually by 2020 in order to finance the developing countries to establish some strategies which should further help in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So two things were very important in this. First thing, to set the limit that the global temperature rise should be below 2 degrees centigrade on an average, and the second thing, to provide, at least to raise the fund of $100 billion for the developing nations from the developed nations, so that they can also mitigate with the help of finance and technological advancement. They can also cut down their emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Another very important conference of parties, that is 21, which was held in 2015, and it is known as Paris Agreement. It is a landmark in global climate deal. And the agreement was, or we can say this conference of party was held in Paris, France. That's why it is known as Paris Agreement. It has certain specific objectives. The major ones here I will quote. It also had an objective that global warming should be below 2 degrees centigrade. Means the focus is to maintain the global warming below 2 degrees centigrade. It should not exceed this particular limit, but we have to work towards setting the limit of only 1.5 degrees centigrade. Means we have to work by sensing that it should not go above 1.5 degree centigrade limit, but at least it should be maintained below 2 degrees centigrade. This was the major objective of this Paris Agreement. Another very important thing came because in Kyoto Protocol, the binding limits were set for the developed nation, that they can emit only a particular amount of greenhouse emissions in the atmosphere. But such binding limit was not set in Paris Agreement. Instead, that there was nationally determined contributions known as NCDs. Nationally determined contributions were set, which is actually an voluntarily emission reduction objectives which every country should have. And this voluntary emission reduction objectives, or either we can say goal or aim, that will be reviewed every 5 years, and that is to be also submitted by the different nations. Means binding limits were not set, but instead each and every country were directed that they should have their own nationally determined contributions. They have to set certain goals and objectives. They should have their own goals and objectives to take certain climate actions in order to reduce the greenhouse gas. And these objectives, how much it has been worked out, how much it has been achieved, that will be reviewed every 5 years. This was the main new thing that is added in this Paris Agreement. In addition to this, committing industrialized nation to continue giving the climate funding to the developing countries, the agreement called for reaching net zero emission. This is another important thing. It talked about reaching net zero emission by the second half of the century. How net zero emissions will be achieved? The strategy like that whatever emission is, that should be either reduced by some means or should be removed by some means, directly removed. Reduce means by having certain environment, by using certain environment friendly energies like solar energy, wind energy. And if we give the example, to remove directly these emissions, carbon capture storage mechanism is one of the example for that. So that's why the Paris Agreement is seen as a significant step towards international collaboration in fight against the climate change. Means it talked about inclusiveness, means each and every country had to work, should have their own NDCs, nationally determined contributions, should formulate their own objectives and goals to cut down the greenhouse gas emissions. Let us talk about the Conference of Parties 24 Katowice. The goal of COP24 was to complete the rule book for carrying out the Paris Agreement. Means here mainly the whatever that was decided, that was evaluated in Paris Agreement, that has to be reviewed and evaluated in order to carry further the Paris Agreement. So adoption of this Conference of Party Katowice climate package, which established certain rules how nations would disclose their emissions, monitor their progress, and enhance transparency in reaching their NDCs was the result. Means this talked about that nations should disclose their emissions. First thing, they have to disclose their emissions, how much emissions they have done. They have to monitor their progress, how much they are successful in cutting or reducing the greenhouse emissions, and this should have a certain transparency for reaching their NDCs. Means NDCs, what the goal is set by the individual country, whether that goal has been achieved or what is the progress in achieving that particular goal, that all is to be highlighted and all is to be disclosed. This was the main part of this Conference of Party 24 if we talk about. Talking about Conference of Party 25 of 2019, which held in Madrid, it actually focused on finalizing the regulations for global carbon market under Article 6. Because if you remember, student, I have talked about the global carbon market in Kyoto Protocol, where the countries used to trade carbon. They used to have carbon credits, and they can even earn CER, they can even earn the carbon. Means suppose if a country that has a limit that can only emit 100 units of carbon, if one unit is we can say 100 or 1000 ton, if a certain country is eligible for emitting only 100 unit emissions of greenhouse emissions, suppose it is certain country A, but it emits 110, means it exceeds 10 units. Its limits was 100 only. But another country B, suppose it has the limit that this can also emit only 100 unit greenhouse emission, but its actual emission is 90 unit. 90 unit means this country B has a balance of 10 units. This country B has a balance of 10 units. Means now this country which exceeds 10 units, this A country can buy the balance of 10 units from country B. And thus they can justify their 110 units emission. This is one of the example of carbon trading. There are other mechanism of also carbon trading, like the developed nations can establish certain carbon reduction projects in the developing nations, and they can earn some carbon credits. Even between the developed nations, they can have certain carbon emission reduction projects, and they can again earn some carbon credits. Means there are different mechanism of carbon trading. So these all things I talked about, if you remember, students, in Kyoto Protocol. So this COP25, it actually aims to regulate for global carbon market under the Article 6 of the sorry, under the article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And it was slated that it was held to be it was thought to be held in Chile, but was rescheduled in Madrid because of some political upheaval in the Chile. But this is the different thing. Apart from this, this COP25 in Madrid, it focused on providing certain solutions regarding the global carbon market. So this thing you have to remember. It focused about providing solution to the global carbon market, sort of facilitating or providing some flexibility in carbon trading. And it also emphasized on the widening gap between the actions required to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the promises made by the nations, that how these objectives will be achieved. So this was the focus point of this COP. Another COP I want to talk here is Glasgow, of which was held in 2021. This was the COP 26th in number. And why it is important? Because this was the first COP after COVID-19. That's why the importance lies here. The first COP after COVID-19, which followed the 5-year review of Paris Agreement, because Paris Agreement talked about the NDCs. I have already talked about NDCs. So that NDCs was said that should be reviewed for every nation after every 5 years. So, so this COP was the first COP following the 5-year review of the Paris Agreement, and as it was held in Glasgow, so it is known as the Glasgow Climate Pact, which necessitated that the nations should phase out coal power and they should strengthen their NDCs by 2020. So main focus is to review of the NDCs of the different nations and how to strengthen this NDC by 2022, and talked about that countries should speed up their efforts in order to move away from the fossil fuels, and they must shift to some cleaner, environment-friendly energy like solar energy, wind energy, in order to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade. One of the again unique thing that this Glasgow summit talked about, the loss and damage. The topic of loss and damage means paying the vulnerable countries like small islands are most affected, means coastal cities and the countries which are most affected by the climate change. So paying these vulnerable countries for the effect of the climate change, this attracted the attentions of the various nations. So this Glasgow summit also talked about the loss and damage, and it also made some of the advancement in the Article 6 of carbon market regulations in order to more facilitate the countries to have easy carbon trading. So the last one, the latest one, if we talk about the COP27 2022, which held in Egypt, it focused on tackling the climate impacts that were already hurting the vulnerable regions. When I'm talking about the vulnerable region, actually I talk about here the small island states and the coastal countries, where this climate impacts were already hurting these vulnerable regions and accelerating the implementation of climate promises. That's why in previous summit that talked about loss and damage fund in order to assist these vulnerable and poor nations and the state, so that they should cope up with climate change effect. And this is very important, how inclusively each and every country should work together to cope up with the climate change. But despite of several worries, the sluggish pace was observed for the carbon reductions from the different countries. There were also discrepancy in the finance pledges, to which country how much finance is to be given, by which mechanism it is given. These were all the major problems that were coming in different COPs. If we talked about the last summit that held in Dubai, that is COP28, held in UAE, it emphasized further advanced talk about the loss and damage mechanism, and it's also talk about reviewing and raising the bar of the nations of NDCs. Means particularly this Dubai summit talked about the stock take, means reviewing the NDCs of the different nations, that what were the goal of these NDCs and how much progress each and every country have made regarding their goals. So nations must fulfill their pledges to cut down their greenhouse emissions, and the developed nation too were also said to supply sufficient climate money and carry out the decisions made at earlier COPs. So these were the few important COPs which I have talked about. Now, after reviewing, after hearing certain things about the COPs which I talked about, some few important things you must have found common in all the COPs. The first thing, finance for the climate. That is the mobilization of the financial resources in order to assist the developing nations in mitigating the emissions and adapting with the effect of the climate change. So this was almost, it was identified about the finance for climate change in each and every COPs. And if you have seen, the commitment made was to raise $100 billion annually as a climate finance, which will act as a great pillar of negotiations, and where the developing nations and the poor nations will be also included in the effort of mitigating with this climate change, mitigating with the emissions with the help of this finance from the climate change. So generally we talked about in all the COPs about this. Second thing all the COPs focused was adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation, how to reduce the causes of the climate change. That is what we call it mitigation. So mitigation was the main focus of almost all the COPs, and even subsequent conferences, if you have reviewed, they have placed the focus on necessity of adaptation to the some unavoidable effects of the climate change. So that was also a common point in all the COPs. Third thing, the equity and the responsibility, because we know the developed nations, they were more responsible for the a larger amount of greenhouse emissions in the atmosphere. So they should lead the responsibility of cutting down the greenhouse emission. That's why the COPs talked about the common but differential responsibilities known as CBDR. Principle is still influencing the negotiation, this principle. Another common point which subsequent COPs followed, that is the global stock stake, that is reviewing the Paris Agreement after every 5 years, because in Paris Agreement we talked about the NDCs. So these NDCs in which each and every country have to set their own objectives and goals to cut down the greenhouse gas emissions. So these has to be reviewed every 5 years, that how much progress they have achieved in order to achieve the set goals. So global stock stake was also one of the important point to be noticed. And here I am talking about, which we talked in different conference of parties, that is Article 6 carbon markets, because it is one of the main topic of all the COPs, mostly the recent one, that has been a creation of global carbon market under Article 6 of Paris Agreement. And it was also, although it was proven controversial in terms of maintaining the environmental integrity, but these carbon market Article 6 was to enable the nations to exchange carbon reductions and are thought to be a means of promoting affordable climate action. That's why it plays a very important role. So these are the few of the, we can say, important topics at different COPs which we have discussed. You must have noticed, that is the finance for climate change, adaptation and mitigation, equity and responsibility, global stock stake, Article 6 and carbon market. So that's all for today, student. Have a nice day. Thank you.